Good afternoon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to yet another edition of Truth to Power with me, Faraz Patel. For the next 1 hour, we are going to be discussing various topics. Of course, the first half an hour, we'll be discussing VBS Mutual Bank. Well, one of the latest developments, of course, saw the Merofang municipality acting CEO being arrested yesterday with regards to his role in the looting of VBS Mutual Bank. And of course, there were 9 others that were arrested last week, but each of them have paid their 100,000 Rand bail. But of course, this extends back to 2 years ago when a report called The Great Bank Heist by advocate Terry Mutau had exposed senior politicians from various parties in their role with regards to VBS Mutual Bank. Now remember, this was a bank that many poor black Africans had put their life savings in to make sure when they'd finish work or any sort of retirement, they could go ahead and enjoy that money. Well, that money is not there anymore. And it is typically and badly unfortunate that this has gone ahead and happened. Because the question is, how are they going to get their money? The bank is no more there. Of course, major problems are happening with regards to it. And that means these poor black Africans who were supposed to have their life savings won't have it anymore. Well, yesterday, the economic freedom fighters held a roundtable discussion with a group of journalists. Its leader, Julius Malema, offered them to ask them any sort of question with regards to what they can find out with regards to VBS. It lasted for 2 hours, a few heated discussions, but at the end of it, some answers still had not come out. Well, of course, to discuss this with me with regards to the VBS Mutual Bank and, of course, yesterday's press conference, I'm going to be joined later on by News 24 investigative journalist Carl Cowan, who's going to go ahead and give me his verdict. His name was, of course, mentioned in there, but some of his other media colleagues were, of course, able to go ahead and be invited with regards to that roundtable discussion. This is a very unfortunate scenario that has happened. But VBS Mutual Bank, remember, is just one part of what has happened with regards to so much of looting that has happened over the years. We also need to look pre-1994 of the looting that had happened during apartheid and how bad that was. Of course, it was swept under the carpet. But there's many more, of course, the Rand manipulation that occurred with regards to the 4 major banks and their role with regards to it is another topic of discussion also. And then there are going to be so many others. The other one, of course, being Stateowned and what has happened with regards to Stateowned. Another unfortunate incident that had happened 3 years ago. So many challenges to go through, so many discussions to go through. But of course, VBS Mutual Bank, right at this very moment, seems to be the discussion on everyone's mind. What happens now with regards to the 10 that were charged? They, of course, did pay their 100,000 Rand each bail. But what's going to happen to them? Is there a sense of accountability? The other question that we need to ask ourselves is, are these 10 right now the scapegoats for the bigger picture, for the bigger people who were involved in this heist? Because at the end of the day, there are many poor people that are suffering with regards to this. And that is the unfortunate situation that is coming at this very moment. So hopefully there will be answers. Hopefully the NPA and the Hawks can continue their prosecution with regards to making sure that they find those who are accountable at this very moment. Because that's the most important factor with regards to this, getting the sense of accountability. And I think that's going to be the difficult situation, is about trying to go ahead and find that sense of accountability. And once that accountability is there, of course, the authorities can go ahead and prosecute many others. Or, like I mentioned, yesterday was the press conference of the EFF, and what happened there. Of course, roundtable discussions. There was an incident that occurred on social media where a journalist had asked the EFF leader, Julius Malema, to go ahead and empty his wallet. Some say it was a form of human disgrace that he had to go ahead and empty his wallet. Others said that maybe this was a reason for him to show that maybe he potentially could be innocent with regards to that. So the EFF involvement is obviously through a gentleman by the name of Brian Shivambu. Brian Shivambu is the brother of the deputy president of the EFF, Floyd Shivambu. So, of course, Brian Shivambu's name has been mentioned in the Terry Mutau report, which was, of course, the Great Bank Heist, and obviously what had happened with regards to that. So the EFF, they've distanced themselves away from this. And I think it's going to be very, very interesting to see with regards to what happens with their involvement in this whole scenario. And of course, what happens with regards to other politicians. There have been ANC politicians that have been involved with regards to this. So again, what will the ANC do, whoever their politicians are, be it senior structures or within the branches within the party? So I think that's really going to be interesting with regards to that. So just to take away some of what had happened at the press conference, of course, the EFF had said that if it is members within their party that were involved in any sort of corruption, not just VBS Mutual Bank, they had said that as the proper leadership, they won't be taking a charge of it, that they will be going ahead and just sorting they will need the bottom leadership to go ahead. So hopefully after this ad break, we'll be able to speak to Carl Cowan and get more from him with regards to the VBS scandal. Stay tuned to Truth to Power. Welcome back to Truth to Power. So joining me via Skype to discuss VBS Mutual Bank and, of course, the root cause of what had happened, I'm joined by investigative journalist from News 24, Carl Cowan. Carl, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Faraz, and thank you for having me.
Okay, Carl. Well, yesterday, of course, you and I just had a brief discussion with regards to the press conference that happened at the EFF headquarters. I know your colleague, Matsidiso Madia, was there. Just your take on what had happened. Do you think that Julius Malema held himself accountable for some of the questions that were asked, or do you feel he potentially dodged a bullet?
I think it's very difficult to put a politician down in front of a group of journalists and then you hope for some form of interrogation. What he had repeatedly said is that he wants these journalists to act as prosecutors, and he wants them to sort of try and interrogate him on these issues. I don't think it went particularly well for Mr. Malema, but I don't think it went particularly badly for him either. His supporters, of course, are ramping it up as a victory. He, of course, over the next couple of weeks are going to say, look, I invited the media to come and interrogate me, and they didn't have anything for me. They had no evidence. They've just got rehashed, repeated allegations. But we need to be very clear for us that the media, the bar for the evidence in the media is not the same as what it is in a criminal court or in a court of law. And a very good example of this is we know for a fact that some of the men arrested for the VBS bank heist in the last couple of weeks, they received multiple payments of upwards of millions of rands. We're looking at 16 to 25 million for each of these individuals, some of them a lot less. And this is from, the report, the report by Advocate Terry Matau. And what we see in the charge sheet is something completely different. We see lesser amounts. And this is very important because in court, it's about what can be proven. Journalistically, when you're writing a news story and you have evidence in front of you that shows 5 million rand and you can verify that, you write about 5 million rand. A criminal prosecutor might look at 5 million and say, only about 1 million of this is dodgy.
And I think that's important, Carl, because obviously Polly van Wyk from the Daily Maverick, who of course was one of the first journalists, if I'm not mistaken, to go ahead and write the article on VBS Mutual Bank. And it seems that she pointed out each and every detail with regards to how the looting had taken place. So the question I ask you is, looking at that, is that something that the court can use with regards to the prosecution when it does go further than just the 10 that have been charged? And I'm including, of course, the Merufang municipality acting CEO who was charged yesterday.
Yeah, so the courts do sometimes take media reports into account, but again, it's not evidence. We're dealing with two very different types of things. Investigative journalism, like what Polly has done, like what many of my colleagues have written as well, people from Amabungani and particularly Dewald van Rensburg, previously of the City Press, they delved very extensively into the matter surrounding VBS. And a prosecutor or an investigator can look at those stories and say, well, these are good leads. So let's see if we can find the evidence to back it up. Of course, on occasion, you do get requests from investigators and from prosecutors to say, listen, you've got this evidence, you've published some of it, but we'd really like to have it as part of our investigation. And the media's role then is not to get involved in a criminal investigation. That's not our job. Our job is to, speak truth to power and hold people accountable. And that's what we do. So if a prosecutor sees something in a story written by Paulie van Wyk or published in the Daily Maverick or anywhere else, and they want that information, then they have to follow their own processes to go and find it. And I must just put this out there. It is much easier for a criminal investigator who's working for, say, the Hawks or for the detective branch of the SAPS to get their hands on crucial financial information. So by the time you're reading about things in the media, it's either because we have really good sources, A, or B, we've done our job and we've sort of verified what we can off bank statements that were leaked to us, et cetera, et cetera. Law enforcement officers have access to those things. They've had access to them for a lot longer than the media has. So if you're reading about something as a story in the media, you must just be quite well aware that law enforcement agencies are probably 6 months to a year behind the media's investigations. So that's quite concerning, because it really is a crucial function of investigative journalism to unearth details surrounding cases like these. But at the same time, with something like VBS, with 2 billion rand was stolen from from pensioners, from Stokvels in Limpopo, and municipalities, service delivery has been impacted. You would expect law enforcement to have had a handle on this a long time ago. These arrests should have been made a year ago. We should have started recovering some of these funds, which has been done, but not a lot of it has been recovered. You shouldn't be reading about, money that went to the EFF in the media. Our law enforcement agencies should be telling us about this, and we should be finding out about it in court.
Carl, let's go to the root cause of what had happened. How was this able to happen? Because here we're talking about a black-owned bank, something that will allow, as you mentioned, old ladies, especially black African old ladies, who can go ahead and put their life savings, their pensions, stokvels, money that could be used to help municipalities. How is this able to go ahead and fall into the wrong hands and see the proper collapse? And when we use the word proper, we talk about institutionally something that is damaging a collapse of a bank that was meant to stand the test of time.
Yeah, you're very right. And it's a combination of things, and I think it's best described in a very short and simplified summary as follows. What these men, those who've been arrested now, led by the former chairperson of the bank, Mr. Matotsi, what they did is they essentially created fictitious credit balances in bank accounts to then draw money out of those bank accounts, of existing funds that were already in the bank. And then when they transfer that from this fictitious account into one of the big four banks' accounts at FNB or Nedbank or Absa, for example, then that bank notices, he has an incoming deposit. It's coming from this bank. They say it's all fine. It's all backed up. So then they credit that balance, and that's how the money becomes real. Now, of course, they've offset to try and plug that gap. They took investments from municipalities, from state-owned institutions. They very famously tried to get R1 billion out of PRASA, which was stopped pretty quickly by, just some absolute, truly heroic behavior by the CFO of PRASA, who stopped this investment from happening against, under extreme pressure and against all odds. So what happens then when you do this sort of offsetting and fictitious accounting, then you create a hole, because then the real money starts disappearing. The real investment money starts disappearing. So they approach more and more municipalities to push more and more money into the bank to try and fill up the gap and try and close over, paper over the cracks, sort of. And then eventually you start realizing that you're actually operating a massive Ponzi scheme, and you've borrowed from Peter to pay Paul, and you've paid Paul far too much, and Peter doesn't have enough money left for you. And suddenly you're starting to lie on your regulatory filings. Now, banks have to file, and especially VBS, it was a mutual bank. So under the Mutual Banks Act, it had to file annually regulatory returns. Like it's almost like we have to file annually tax returns, but they're just a lot more involved. Masses of documents, pages and pages, hundreds of pages of documents. And these regulatory filings have to be signed off by auditors and internal audit committees. So what do? You bribe everybody. You buy them a nice house, you buy them a nice car so that they don't talk about the fact that the money is being stolen, that it's all going missing. You bribe them all, and you lie to the South African Reserve Bank, and you lie to the public in your financial statements, and all this money is gone. You're spending it on Lamborghinis and helicopters and buying nice houses for yourself. And in the meantime, what happens is exactly what happened to VBS. Eventually, the bubble pops. Someone realizes, but listen, there's a massive hole in the books here, and you guys have just been doing some very, very creative accounting. And that's what necessitates something like this. Institutional collapse. It was looted to the point where there was literally no other way but for the bank to be liquidated. So despite some politicians saying, oh, the bank should have been saved, it should have been saved, by mid-2018, the bank was past saving. It was finished. It was done. That's why the investigation happened, and that's why we're seeing people being arrested now.
You know, Carl, this is taken actually, when you've been listening to all of this, you'd feel this is taken from the script of Brian de Palma's The Untouchables with regards to the way Al Capone went ahead and obviously did irregularities with the books. But Carl, the question that needs to be asked is, how was Treasury, SARS, the South African Reserve Bank able to not pick this up? I know you mentioned bribery as part of it, but surely institutions with the credibility that they have should have been able to say, something's not happening here and it needs to be investigated.
You know, and that's part of the bigger question about VBS that I think bothers a lot of people, is when you think about it, if a bank like VBS, and we're talking about 2 billion rand, but we're not talking about, and this is going to sound really strange, but we're not talking about a lot of money. When you think about a bank, 2 billion rand is not a lot. When you want to start talking about FNB, Absa, Nedbank, those banks, which are regulated under different acts and different laws, I must just point out, then it's something different. You know, you're talking about trillions in the space of a year. You know, it's no longer billions. VBS, I think, was a very unique example of a mixture of political will to make sure that these things are not being found out, because you'll remember that a lot of politically connected people were making a lot of money. And this was across the board. So this was, you know, from politicians on the ground and councils in Limpopo to national level ANC politicians and even opposition parties. So, you know, VBS essentially paid the way not to be discovered. But there is a very serious question to be asked. You know, Mr. Malema, yesterday during that press conference he mentioned something very, very important, that there were reports and, you know, sort of whistleblowers coming forward to report fraud at the bank and theft at the bank long before this investigation by the South African Reserve Bank. And we have to go back and understand when and where that happened and what was done surrounding that. I know that if it wasn't for action from the Reserve Bank, even if it was belated, we may still not have known about this. You know, VBS could have gone into liquidation. They could have declared bankruptcy. There would have been a very lengthy liquidation inquiry, and then they would have discovered some of these things. But the Reserve Bank noticed it early enough, and the liquidator, Mr. Anush Ruplal, they sort of immediately off the bat, they realized something was not right. This entire investigation was started because some very clever people at the South African Reserve Bank put 2 and 2 together. It started with a 1 billion rand investment from PRASA that was being politically, you know, sort of pushed through. They were trying to get it through. And that 1 billion rand would have, you know, in the words of one of the middlemen of the VBS saga, it would have kept them alive for another year. It would have kept the scheme going for another year. And that's 1 billion rand in taxpayer money that would have gone from PRASA into this bank. And that triggered eyebrows being raised. And, you know, I was part of a story that was published on the front page of the Sunday Times, you know, in the lead up to that that investment being made. And that triggered this investigation. The Reserve Banks looked at this, and then they went back and looked at the regulatory filings. They noticed things were not adding up 100%. And that's when they started asking questions. So it's a story of eventual oversight, but perhaps we should be having a discussion about, you know, is the oversight stringent enough? Is it strong enough to pick up things like these early enough? Should this not have been picked up in the first year that some of this money was being moved around back in 2016, 2017? And the only answer I have to that, which I've grappled with repeatedly, is that these guys were so clever in how they did it. They had an engagement partner from KPMG, you know, sign off on their regulatory audits. If you see an audit report from KPMG, you don't immediately start checking every fact and figure in it. You accept that the work has been done properly.
And I think that's unfortunate because, as you mentioned, you got someone from KPMG, sounds like a credible source. You would take it as the immediate gospel. Carl, one final question. Of course, the NPA and the Hawks acted with regards to the arrest of the first 10. Have they now set the precedents with regards to arresting even more of those who were involved with VBS Mutual Bank and other, looting that had happened, of course, during state capture, pre-state capture? Is this the precedent that has been set with regards to the NPA and the Hawks to go ahead and prosecute even further people?
We certainly hope so, and we've been hearing these promises for a very long time. At this point, I am very reluctant to believe that the NPA is going to start moving very quickly on other cases. We want to see justice done. As a citizen of the country and not as a journalist, it would be good for me, as a patriot, to see my country acting against, just absolutely horrible corruption that affects people's lives so badly, but at the same time, when I put my journalist hat on, you do have to realize that the NPA is struggling. They are, under-resourced. They do have the staff capable of investigating these things, and so does the Hawk. But there's a lot of moving parts to investigations like these, and they do take time. But in terms of the state capture investigations, I think we could have been a lot further along in terms of seeing some arrests at least. And we mustn't discount the window dressing that is a series of arrests like this on a high-profile case. It gives the idea that the NPA is covering the length and breadth of the country and that they're doing a great job. But, for example, there's an example raised repeatedly about Steinhoff. Much more money involved. It's white-collar crime. These are people, JSE-listed companies that committed serious acts of fraud, and we still haven't seen arrests. We haven't seen any action being taken. We're not even going to start talking about the Gupta family and state capture. Let's not even go down that road, because then we'll be here till tomorrow. But it is very important for the director of the Advocate Shamila de Batoy. It's very important for her to see these arrests done in a manner that is not only satisfying to the public, but in a manner that will ensure conviction. We do not want someone like Mr. Matotsi of VBS, being acquitted at the end of the day or getting away with it because of the way that an investigation was done or some technical glitch. We want to see true justice. We want to see consequences. So it has to be done properly. We have to be patient, and we just have to keep on reminding ourselves that these people are still out there. Some of them are still doing business with government. And as citizens and as journalists, we should hold these people accountable by reminding them constantly every time they speak, but weren't you the person who stole so much money from the Free State government or from this or there? And I think that's a very important function. NPA needs to act. They need to move faster, but at the same time, we need to just give them space and have a little patience so they can do it properly. If and when the time comes and the arrests are done and they've been busy for 5 years and there are then problems with the prosecution or the investigation, then we rake them over the coals and we make life really, really tough for them.
Carl Cowan, News 24 investigative journalist, thank you so much for making the time for us. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me.
Well, there we go. Of course, Carl just giving us a breakdown of VBS Mutual Bank and, of course, the rabbit hole that still needs to be gone with regards to this case. It's not just VBS Mutual Bank. There's so many others. I mentioned Steinhoff. Of course, I earlier on had mentioned the 4 banks that had, of course, manipulated the rand. So the NPA and the Hawks have a real battle on their hands. And the question is that, as he mentioned, us as media need to go ahead and keep reminding these authorities and keep holding those who had committed corruption and fraud, keeping them to account. Well, after the break, of course, on Wednesday, Minister of Finance Tito Mboweni gave his supplementary budget speech. And I tell you what, it is a very bleak picture. I'll be having a panel of economists and a financial analyst to discuss this. Stay tuned to Truth to Power. Welcome back to Truth to Power. Well, of course, on Wednesday, Minister of Finance Tito Mboweni unveiled his supplementary budget speech This was, of course, an important budget speech with regards to COVID-19 that is happening and, of course, the continuous contraction of the economy. Again, South Africa was in a recession pre-COVID-19 and, of course, the lockdown. And, of course, the lockdown hasn't made anything easier. So joining me via Zoom, we have a panel of analysts. Number one, we have Tsepo Khadima, who's an economist. And of course, we have Azim Mia, who is a financial analyst, just to give you some advice on what you need to do as a consumer and as a taxpayer during these difficult times. And I'm also joined by Mielani Mkabela. He's an economist from Answiwa Transaction Advisory. Gentlemen, thank you so much for making the time for us. Tsepo, I'm going to start with you. What was your take on the supplementary budget speech that was given on Wednesday?
Well, the supplementary budget and therefore has a lot of anxiety and confusion. Confusion that we had that there's going to be over 2 trillion rand in spending, and yet the economy is going to contract. The minister would tell us that the economy will contract by the factor of 7%. My own computation is that from the lockdown period to date, the contraction will be in excess of 9.6%.
Tsepo, I'm just going to go to the next case. I'm going to ask you while I'm doing that, if you could just maybe turn your camera around so we can get a perfect picture of you. Mielani, your thoughts on the supplementary budget speech?
This is a disaster, and thanks for the viewers at home. It's a disaster. The country doesn't probably have enough as expected. We have seen that, like the Minister of Finance and the Deputy Minister of Finance, they were going in different areas to source funds. So if looking at what we have managed to get, I believe that it's a good a solution for the country to work with like now. And actually, I'm pleased with the work that they have done thus far, and the leadership altogether moving to this level. From the president and the finance minister and the minister of health, they have done very well actually to reach where we are, and we really need to applaud them for such, because I mean, like, this is a disaster. In a disaster like this, if they manage to get whatever they've presented yesterday, like yesterday, is good for for the economy.
Azim, I'm going to come to you as a financial analyst. When you're advising taxpayers and consumers of the country who are already hard hit financially with regards to the recession and now with COVID-19, with many businesses being affected, how does this make someone feel with regards to sorting out their finances during these difficult times?
Good afternoon, Faraz, and good afternoon to the viewers as well. I agree with Mielani. I think the minister did a great job with the limited resources that he does have and the tools at his disposal. And before pre-pandemic, we were already in a dire situation. And I think COVID-19, just this exogenous shock, dealt a harsh blow to economic activity. And in this, we've seen through the lockdowns, many people losing their jobs. We've seen businesses close their doors and lose revenue. And in turn, this has actually affected the fiscal ability to collect further tax revenues. And through this, we could see that the shortfall would need to be funded somehow. And we heard the minister talk about a $7 billion debt package that they need to get through. And an additional 40 billion rand of raising tax revenues. So what this means to the individuals, those who still have stable jobs going forward, there's obviously a few tools that SARS can use to pull that from a tax perspective. And they haven't quite indicated the level of detail that they would go to this. And they have mentioned whether it would be for personal income taxpayers, whether it would be through VAT, or whether it would be through corporate tax. But there's definitely going to be some news, that's my forecast, in the next budget of tax changes and a way of shifting some of the spending from the haves to to fund some of the shortages and the deficit. And right now, as a consumer, we can see that the MPC has actually done quite a bit in trying to assist the situation as it is. And we see interest rates are extremely low at the moment, and it makes it very tempting for people that are currently not in debt to go out and seek further debt. And I think the one thing we need to be careful for is, in a time like this, it's very important to save and keep aside emergency funds.
Tsepo, Azim mentioned just that, of course, with interest rates being down, but when listening to Minister Tito Mboweni and saying that the economy will contract, well, is going to contract by 7.2%. This is the largest contraction in 90 years. That doesn't paint a good picture, doesn't it, Tsepo?
It doesn't paint a good picture at all. But even on the issue of interest rates, we must bear this in mind, that, the 200 billion rand in guarantee that was provided there hasn't been any uptake. And the reason that there hasn't been any uptake should not surprise us, is purely because the legislative framework in terms of banking under the South African Banks Act has not been amended to allow lending to all manner of businesses without having to apply prudent lending practices. So the reason why only 7 billion out of the 200 billion guarantee has been uptaken is purely because the rules have not changed. But on the other hand, as I say, in fact, the contraction is going to be worse than the 7.2%. Based on really to date what we have seen, we have to bear this in mind. The GDP of South Africa is just over 14.1 billion rand a day. And during the process of the lockdown, we have seen in excess of 70% of rather contraction in that 14.1 billion GDP activity. And that prolonged over a period of time, hence I'm saying we are looking at about 9.6% instead of 7.2%. And the fact that revenues also have fallen and there hasn't been any amendments to the tax code of South Africa. Some of us have been talking about that for a long time, because the tax code of South Africa is more on consumption than on income. And corporate sector, with the contraction that we have seen, means that we effectively going to have, of the 300 billion in tax revenue shortfall, is going to be attributable largely to the corporate sector as opposed to the consumer tax collection.
Mielani, I want to come to you, of course, when looking at the contraction in South Africa, and I think we need to look at it from a global perspective. The United States themselves are having contractions to the economy, and they're seen as a powerhouse with regards to world economy. And then, of course, you look at the Middle Eastern nations who are seen as oil-rich nations. They themselves at this moment could be facing a similar fate. But we need to look home, and we need to look at South Africa, and we need to ask ourselves, with regards to this contraction, what does Treasury need to do to make sure that we don't fall deeper, as Tsepo said, past the 9% mark?
Like for that, if you look at the scope from the global market, in February during the budget speech, it was expected that contraction will be around 3.3%. And recently, now during this COVID-19 or on the supplementary budget, it is expected that a contraction of around 5.2% for the global economy. So if you look at that, it's not something that we say it affects South Africa, but it's a global scenario that comes down to affect our economy with that about 7.2% contraction. So when you analyze all those aspects, you will really need to come up with things that will be critical in assisting the economy. I believe that if we look on infrastructure, and then we look at infrastructure and industrialization as a critical element that we will use to turn around our economy, I feel that will be good. But we really need to look at ways on the borrowing metrics that we will use, because like when you look at South Africa, you have ideology coming in front of solutions at times, where you find that other people willing, like the finance minister, to probably source funds from certain institutions, and who are expected probably to go to institutions that they prefer. So it's not an easy thing as well to move, because there is politics. But if probably we're open from sourcing funds like everywhere, who are supposed to probably reduce this contraction far better by coming up with funds that can assist like in the market. Because when you look at your IMF can have funds. We can have ways at reviewing the agreements that IMF can give us. We are far better than 1980 now. And South Africa we have professionals in different markets. In development finance, we understand banking, we understand financial markets as well, at the same level with them at IMF. There's no difference with them now and South Africa. So everything we can scrutinize, but I think there is that, a backwardness that is still there, where people are still afraid of IMF. And we're not supposed to be afraid of IMF, because we can look at agreements that they can give us, and then we see if we can proceed with that or not. But manufacturing and infrastructure are critical things that can take the economy to the next level, because with that, you are looking at building something that is sustainable. And in the next 10 years, in the next 20 years, we'll still have something that will be supplementing the South African economy to be competitive. And at the same time, we will be expected to improve in our competitiveness with regard to exporting a lot of commodities to the global market and take advantage of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. So those things, with regard to infrastructure and industrialization, it's a good route that South Africa was supposed to attend to, and not only focus on small aspects, but critically decisive leadership that will be committed in building infrastructure and industries that will make us to be sustainable in the future.
Azim, I want to come to you. And of course, on Wednesday, Minister Tito Mboweni said that they're expecting a 300 billion rand tax shortfall, of course, due to COVID-19. Now, when COVID-19 does pass us, what are the chances as a consumer that tax will be increased to make up the shortfall? Is this something that we should fear, especially from a consumer perspective, where already people's pockets are starting to run dry?
Yes, Faraz. I mean, I think in terms of this, it's obviously not a unilateral decision that has to be made and as simple as saying that there's a shortfall, let's take it from corporate tax or individuals. It has to be looked at holistically. And based on where the economic activity is at that point in time, what the unemployment rate is, and what other measures government can put into place. At the same time, you don't want to raise taxes too much and de-incentivize corporates and businesses' ability to promote job creation. And we heard the minister refer to a separate package of 20 billion that will be allocated towards job creation. And from that perspective, it's difficult to say that tax will definitely be increased, but there's a high probability that it will be increased, because as Tito Mboweni mentioned, that it's like the jaws of a hippopotamus, that keeps on widening, and this gap of this budget deficit that keeps on increasing. I mean, at February, in March, at the initial budget speech, it was projected to be at 6.8%. And re-looking at it now, they're expecting it to be at about 15%. So at these levels, to fund the shortfall additionally to borrowing, there is a high probability that some form of it will be recouped through tax increases.
Tsepo, I want to come to you. Yesterday, of course, I think it was from last week, during the National Assembly plenary, and yesterday during the Portfolio Committee on Finance, the sovereign debt crisis. I know that Minister Tito Mboweni has been speaking about this for quite some time. What point will South Africa reach with regards to the sovereign debt crisis? Is that a reality, or are we still far away from that happening?
Well, Minister Tito Mboweni spoke as a politician and not as a technocrat when he was delivering the supplementary budget, where he's like to make South Africans believe that the sovereign debt crisis is about 2-3 years away. In fact, as a matter of course, we are in a sovereign debt crisis as a country. Pre-COVID lockdown, already South Africa was having to borrow in excess of 628 million rand every single day just to pay interest on the 3.56 trillion debt we had. And because of COVID, he's now having to increase the borrowing from 230 billion for this financial year to in excess of 400 billion, therefore bringing our total level of indebtedness to over 4 trillion. But the mere fact that we are not able, from the tax revenues, to be able to service our debt in terms of paying for the interest that we are having to borrow just to pay interest, does actually mean we are in a sovereign debt crisis. The question that has to be asked is actually the borrowing that they are hoping to get from IMF, is it going to be sufficient? And my answer is a simple no, it is not sufficient. And the Minister of Finance knows this. If anything now, spending, public spending, they were supposed to have been cutting with a chainsaw, not even with a razor or a knife. But if anything, there is no intention to actually cut down public spending. They are looking to increase that to over 2 trillion rand. Unfortunately, it is not going into the productive sectors of the economy. If anything, is going towards servicing our debt, indebtedness, at the same time to try and spend on social spending. Right now, if you look at it from COVID-related expenditure, taking into account the 130 billion rand reprioritization of spending, it means that this government has been spending in excess of 700 million rand every single day on COVID-related relief measures or combating COVID-19. The question that has to be asked is that, has that been efficient? Have we received fair value for the money that has been spent? And my own assessment is that no, because the cases continue to increase. If anything, the Minister of Health tells us that next week we are going to see a tripling of the infection rate that we already have in the country. So the 700 million rand every day that is being spent on COVID-19 in terms of budget reprioritization has been wasteful and fruitless expenditure. But the mere fact that industries continue to be at a standstill because of a lockdown, therefore the economy continuing to shrink. Just yesterday, Statistics South Africa told us that our level of unemployment is the highest in history. And in the next quarter, when they report again, my own assessment, taking into account the UIF claims that are there and the number of small businesses that have closed, is that means we are going to breach official unemployment by over 40%, purely because right now the government itself seems to be perplexed. They don't know what really to do. And they don't seem to have been able to have the capacity or the gumption to match science in terms of what we got to know with COVID. And therefore, lockdown should have been eased a lot more earlier, taking into account some of the advices that have come forth. For example, from jurisdictions such as Hong Kong, from jurisdictions such as Taiwan, such as South Korea, which have even Japan, for example, highly densified populations have not had hard lockdowns and therefore have been able to cushion their economies. In our case, we haven't been able to. But for the minister to believe that we can borrow our way out of the current crisis, it is naive and it is irresponsible politicking, in my opinion, because to borrow even more money but not going into the productive sectors of the economy is only going to sink us more deeper. We are already in a sovereign debt crisis.
Mielani, I want to come to you. Of course, state-owned enterprises has been, one hot topic because many of them have needed to rely on government bailouts, South African Airways being one of them. And I think earlier on, government had voted on some sort of a reform to have the business rescue practitioners go ahead with their plan, and of course having other investors go ahead and try and save the airline. There was no mention of any sort of state-owned enterprises on Wednesday in that supplementary budget speech. So Mialani, my question to you is, what happens to them, especially the others besides South African Airways and of course Eskom? I'm talking about PRASA, I'm talking about Transnet, I'm talking about Denel, and of course the SABC, which seems to be on its way to retrenching a number of employees.
State-owned enterprises were not affected by COVID-19. I can start from there because state-owned enterprises collapsed before, and the poor management of state-owned enterprises happened, like November last year. We were aware of almost SAA going to business like rescue. But I think what is important on state-owned enterprises is making sure that you get Eskom to be like financed and then turn around. So a restructuring of Eskom is critical for the economy because energy is an oxygen of each and every economy all over the world. So you will need to resolve the problems that Eskom has if you want to think about industrialization. And at the same time, in whatever economic model that you will need to come up with, energy is a critical element. And when you look from probably around 1980 up until like now, the changes in electricity or in energy and the changes in the productivity of manufacturing, they are aligned. As electricity gets expensive, manufacturing goes down because the cost of production, the cost of mining becomes high. So those aspects, you'll need to attend to it. So it's a priority for the South African industry. There is no other option. Eskom needs to be attended to. Transnet needs to be looked at because it's a critical aspect for our global procurement and supply of everything locally and in the globe. And then you as well need PRASA to be attended to because it is the one that is moving people from townships and locations to industrial sectors. So these three state-owned enterprises, I believe they are a priority to assist the economy to move forward. And the rest of the ones that I didn't mention, like SAA and others, probably you can ignore them as not really having the importance as they can demand. But Transnet, PRASA, and Eskom are critical state-owned enterprises that needs to be restructured, and we see quickly that they are working very well.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to wrap this up. I'm going to come to you, Azim. As a consumer, listening to what obviously Minister Tito Mboweni had said, what is the road ahead for the average man on the street, for the working class person who needs to go ahead and make ends meet? What do they need to do now during these difficult times, currently in COVID-19 lockdown and of course post-COVID-19?
Yes, Faraz, I think it's a difficult time for many people with businesses closing. The lockdowns had a severe impact. And I think the one thing that, from a personal perspective, that the consumer on the street can do is to increase their savings. And South Africans historically have never had the ability to save compared to other nations. And that's because of the state of our economy. And I think it goes in unison. When an economy thrives, the consumers of the economy thrive. And it works hand in hand, because for an economy to thrive, you need spending to take place. And that spending is the main driver of economic growth. And when the man on the street is suffering, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy that the economy suffers as well. And you need to rely on external factors to try and drive this economic growth. So right now, government needs to take the steps. And we keep on hearing of this term over the years from different ministers of structural reform and changes in policies. And understandably, these things take a long time to manifest the desired outcomes. But government needs to lay the pathways and focus on individual ways to empower people to be able to be in a position to save, to be able to be in a position to be entrepreneurial. And the three things before closing off that I think government, like Melanie said, electricity and the ESCOM issue needs to be sorted out if we want our economy to thrive, and therefore the men on the street. Education, we need to invest in education heavily, as well as making business easy to do in our country. And it's almost a bit of deregulation in terms of opening up more free market and allowing people to express their entrepreneurship and changing the regulation so that people have access to funding to open up businesses, to create employment, and therefore create income and further their spending.
Gentlemen, it's been an absolute pleasure hosting you. Tsepo Khadima, an economist, Mialani Mkabela, an economist from Answiwa Transaction Advisory, and of course Azim Mia, a financial analyst, to go ahead and just give us a breakdown of the supplementary budget speech that was given by Minister of Finance Tito Mboweni on Wednesday. Well, that's all we have for you on Truth to Power. It's been an absolute pleasure hosting you once again. I will see you again next time. Same place, same time. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon and your weekend. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.